Troops from North Korea appear to have fallen back from Russia's front line after suffering heavy losses when engaging Ukrainian forces. Now, the U.S. says that several 100 North Korean soldiers have been killed or injured while fighting for Russia in its war with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says several wounded North Korean soldiers captured by Ukraine while fighting in Russia have died. North Korea continues to support Russia, but the costs of this cooperation are getting heavier every day. According to Ukraine's top military commander, General Oleksandr Syrsky, in just 3 months the North Korean ranks have been cut in half. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that North Korean losses exceeded 4,000. This figure included North Korean soldiers who were eliminated, wounded, and those who escaped from the front lines and surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces. The different geography, the youth and inexperience of the soldiers, the communication and language barriers, and Ukraine's offensive strategy were all a challenge for the North Koreans. These adversities put the North Korean soldiers in a dilemma. Trapped in the thin line between life and death, what decision can North Koreans make? You might think that Koreans raised under ideological pressure would fight no matter what, but for some soldiers, life seems to be more valuable than anything else. The Ukrainian Special Forces Command has announced that North Korean troops are now slowly withdrawing after suffering heavy losses in the Kursk Oblast. The Pyongyang soldiers made the right decision and chose to live and fled, leaving their weapons on the front lines. An official commanding the 1st Combat Diver Battalion of the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces confirmed that he had observed a noticeable change about 2 weeks ago when the North Koreans withdrew from the front line. According to the official, the Russians are everywhere along the front line, working, but the Koreans are absent. U.S. sources also reported that North Koreans have not been seen on the front line for the last 2 weeks. The North Koreans are either analyzing their mistakes, nursing their wounds, or perhaps waiting for reinforcements. Whatever the case, North Korean troops fleeing from the front lines is indeed a serious scandal for Pyongyang-Moscow military cooperation. But the scandals do not stop there. The 11th Airborne Brigade reported that valuables started to disappear with the arrival of the North Koreans. A soldier from the brigade said that the North Koreans were quietly robbing the Russians. The soldier said that a $1,000 Garmin watch was stolen while he was sleeping. This theft caused a wave of panic and anger among Russians. Enraged Russian soldiers thought that the North Koreans were responsible for the incident. Russian soldiers took immediate action, searched the North Koreans, and found the stolen watch. The 11th Airborne Brigade posted a photo of the North Korean soldier who stole the watch on social media. This is a concrete indication of the strained relations between Russian forces and North Korean troops. Despite the strained relations between the militaries, the leaders continue to increase their cooperation. There are reports that the Pyongyang regime is planning to send more troops to Moscow. The South Korean military said in a statement that it suspects North Korea is preparing to send more troops to fight Russian forces. According to military sources close to the Seoul wing, the Pyongyang regime may soon send 45,000 soldiers for the Russian army. This troop deployment could take place in groups of 15,000 in 3 trips. A Ukrainian army commander also supported this claim, noting that North Korea could send missiles and artillery to Russia. He added that North Korea plans to send at least 150 Kn-23 short-range ballistic missiles and more artillery shells to Russia. According to Ukrainian military intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov, North Korea is expected to deploy additional forces to Russia's Kursk Oblast, mainly artillery and rocket artillery units. According to Budanov, Moscow is also preparing to receive more North Korean-made 170mm M1989 Cox and self-propelled artillery guns and M1991 240mm multiple launch rocket systems. Kyrylo Budanov said that Pyongyang had acquired 120 of each system in the last 3 months, deepening its military support for Russia. Kyiv leader Volodymyr Zelensky also announced that North Korea would send 40,000 to 50,000 troops. Zelensky even said that 500,000 Koreans could join the Ukrainian war. The president linked this to the repressive regime in North Korea. These military support decisions reflected Pyongyang's deepening military ties with Moscow and increased international condemnation. But it remains unclear how effective this increased support will be. As we mentioned before, more than 4,000 troops were out of the war. We know that 12,000 troops were sent in the first phase. So more than a third of the North Korean troops have been eliminated. DPRK forces have suffered about 92 casualties a day since December. In this context, the remaining troops are expected to be eliminated by mid-April. It doesn't take a clairvoyant to predict that new recruits will suffer the same fate. So, how did Ukraine achieve this success? 5:33. A Ukrainian commander with a Pole's call sign said that the North Koreans were trying to cross mine-laden fields under heavy fire. The North Koreans also did not understand the threat from modern weapon systems, advancing en masse on foot. This made them a clear threat. So the North Koreans were still using World War II war tactics. But apart from these tactical failures, there was little coordination between North Korean and Russian forces. Language differences and different operational norms caused friction between the forces, which at one point led to the North Koreans mistakenly targeting Russian positions. Most North Korean soldiers are special operations troops trained for surgical strike missions, but the Russians use them more as infantry. Military analysts have expressed concern about this misallocation of resources. Former U.S. official Celeste A. Walanda commented that the employment of North Koreans by the Russians did not match their capabilities, given their special operations background. Instead, the task assigned to them is direct combat. Hence the high casualties among the North Koreans. Why does Kim Jong-un continue to support Russia despite troop losses? This support allows the North Koreans to gain invaluable combat experience, test their weapon systems, gain access to Russian military technologies, and secure further assistance from Moscow in defying UN sanctions. North Korea currently has one of the largest armies in the world, with around 1.3 million active soldiers, however. Unlike Russia, the Korean People's Army has not directly participated in any major war for many years. This lack of battlefield experience is a major concern for North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, who wants to counter South Korea's more technologically advanced military, the dispatch of thousands of soldiers to fight in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Provides the KPA with valuable insights into what is widely regarded as the most technologically advanced battlefield environment in the history of warfare. North Korean soldiers are now learning firsthand the realities of modern drone warfare. This means North Korea will be more capable of waging war against its neighbors. North Korea is believed to have received significant financial and technological incentives in exchange for supplying Putin with troops. South Korean intelligence officials estimate that Moscow pays Pyongyang $2,000 per soldier per month. This money is no doubt welcome, but the real reward is access to advanced Russian military technology. In exchange for troops, North Korea is thought to receive support from Moscow to help the country develop its military, including anti-aircraft, submarine, and missile capabilities. The Ukrainian front also serves as a valuable testing ground for North Korea, allowing the country to evaluate the effectiveness of the weapons it supplies to Russia. This will make it possible for Pyongyang to improve the quality of its domestic arms industry and adapt future outputs to the realities of the modern battlefield. Meanwhile, soldiers who survived their time on the Ukrainian fronts are expected to return home to become instructors and share their knowledge of modern warfare with their colleagues. At this point, North Korea's participation in the Russian occupation of Ukraine seems to be more about improving Kim Jong-un's war machine than supporting Putin's imperial ambitions. In the short term, the presence of North Korean troops allows Russia to overcome its growing manpower shortages. But with Russia losing tens of thousands of soldiers every month, Pyongyang is unlikely to be able to fully meet Moscow's insatiable demand for additional manpower. So, what do we know about Russian military casualties? According to a compilation of reports compiled by the independent media outlets BBC Russian Service and Mediazona, the number of confirmed Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine exceeds 90,000. In fact, both outlets base their causality figures on open sources such as official statements, obituaries, and social media posts. However, Moscow rarely makes official comments on military casualties, calling the conflict a special military operation. The estimates reported by these independent media outlets present a bleak picture of the cost of the invasion to Russian military personnel. Of the casualties documented in the report, 23% were soldiers who signed contracts after the occupation began in February 2022. More than half of those killed had no experience serving in either the Army or the National Guard before the outbreak of war. The average age of those killed in 2024 was 36, compared to 36 in previous years of the conflict. It also showed that 23% of those killed were volunteer soldiers, 17% were contract soldiers, 17% were convicted prisoners, 11% were mobilized soldiers, and almost 3% were privates. These figures form the basis of Russia's extensive mobilization efforts during the war. The hardest-hit regions in terms of confirmed casualties are the republics of Bashkortostan and Tatarstan, with 3,932 and 3,804 confirmed deaths respectively. Moscow and the surrounding region accounted for 3,693 deaths. While the numbers presented by BBC Russia and Media Zona represent about half of the actual death toll, the real figure is believed to be much higher. The organizations estimate Russia's actual military death toll to be between 138,500 and 200,000. However, these figures do not include fighters from the annexed territories of southeastern Ukraine, where there are an estimated 21,000 even to 23,500 additional deaths. In addition, Western and Ukrainian intelligence agencies estimate that Russia's total military casualties will exceed 1 million by April. However, some analysts believe these figures are greatly exaggerated. Whatever the case, Russia's ongoing military intervention in Ukraine has been disastrous for its armed forces. Apart from the death toll, the composition of those exposed in Ukraine has changed dramatically. As of November 2023, volunteer soldiers accounted for only about 14% of Russia's casualties. By the end of 2023, this number had risen sharply, reflecting the Russian military's growing dependence on volunteers to fill its ranks. As the war dragged on, volunteers and prisoners were specifically targeted for recruitment, and the Russian government offered significant incentives to encourage recruitment, including large financial payments. This has been one of the most controversial practices, sending prisoners to the front. Reports show that individuals were recruited even before their criminal cases were tried, often with their sentences suspended when the contract to join the army was signed. This further complicates the nature of Russian forces in Ukraine, as many of these soldiers have little military experience or even any prior training. This has been one of the reasons for the increased reliance on such soldiers, which has contributed to the increase in Russian casualties, and the deaths of Russians have contributed to the increase in casualties. In early 2025, competition for new volunteers continues among Russian regions. With payments to volunteers reaching up to 2 million rubles in some regions, the capital of Bashkortostan has emerged as a leader in these payments, attracting volunteers of all ages from mid-40s to early 50s. Most of these volunteers receive a short training, usually as little as 1 to 2 weeks, before being sent to the front line. Another challenge for Russia has been the growing number of career soldiers among the casualties. 17% of the dead were career military personnel who served in the army before Russia's invasion in 2022. Despite efforts to fill the ranks with volunteers, conscripts, and prisoners, it is clear that the human cost of the conflict continues to take a heavy toll on Russia's military infrastructure. Military analysts say the actual number of Russian casualties could be much higher than can be verified by open sources. Diplomatically, the situation remains tense, especially given the geopolitical implications of the war in Ukraine. According to statements by Kremlin Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov, Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready for negotiations with U.S. President Donald Trump. The Kremlin said that Moscow is waiting for signals from Washington that it is ready for negotiations. This would be a U-turn in Russia's foreign policy stance, as the ongoing conflict has brought Russia's relations with the West to an all-time low. Trump, who took office in January 2025, said earlier in January that Putin was ready to meet with him. He added that a summit between the two leaders was already in the works. In the months leading up to Trump's return, his foreign policy team, including those he planned to appoint as national security advisors, such as Florida Congressman Michael Waltz, had been working behind the scenes to put together the possible meeting. A number of sources have indicated that Switzerland has the potential to host the meeting because the country has long served as a neutral ground for international negotiations. In one of his first moves after taking office, Trump publicly threatened Putin that he would impose heavy tariffs and sanctions on all Russian goods if Russia did not end its war in Ukraine. On January 22nd, Trump stated that if Moscow fails to reach an agreement with Ukraine soon, it will have no choice but to impose high tariffs on Russian exports to the U.S. and other countries involved in the conflict. His remarks were in line with harsh rhetoric against the Russian government, with the U.S. president stating that the ongoing war is hurting not only Russia, but also the world economy. Trump's tariff threats were meant to push Putin towards a diplomatic solution through economic pressure. Despite Trump's tough talk, much remains unclear about the future of the conflict and international diplomacy. But there are a number of complications ahead for real negotiations, and the Trump-led U.S. administration may appear willing to try a diplomatic solution to the war. Putin's domestic political imperatives, the constant military challenges inside Ukraine, and the broader geopolitical environment make all paths to peace highly complicated. For now, Russia's losses continue, and the toll taken by its military forces shows no sign of abating. Casualties in the Russian military have put extreme pressure on the leadership as Moscow struggles to manage the fallout from a long-term war. The loss of troops, coupled with the economic consequences of international sanctions and the collapse of the Russian economy, has left Putin with an increasingly difficult task of explaining this war to the Russian people. Moreover, the growing number of casualties, especially among previously non-military personnel such as prisoners and volunteers, calls into question the sustainability of Russia's military strategy. As a result, the situation in Ukraine remains grave for both Russian forces and the broader geopolitical landscape. As the war enters its third year, Russian military casualties continue to mount, with the actual death toll likely much higher than officially acknowledged. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts, including those spearheaded by President Trump, may be glimmers of hope that could result in a final settlement. But significant obstacles to peace remain. As Russia suffers more and more human and material losses, the prospects for a quick end to the conflict are diminishing. Could these circumstances push Vladimir Putin towards peace talks? In his recent statements on the ongoing war in Ukraine, Putin made waves by claiming that Russia could theoretically hold peace talks with Ukraine, but would not engage directly with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whom he characterized as illegitimate. This view is not new, but was echoed by Putin's claim that Zelensky's presidential term ended last year under martial law. According to Putin, the Ukrainian leader could participate in negotiations, but only through intermediaries. The Kremlin chief added that peace in Ukraine could be quickly restored if the West stopped its aid to Kyiv. If they run out of money and, in general, bullets, they will not exist even for a month, Putin claimed, implying that the Ukrainian government would not survive the moment it was deprived of the consistent financial and military aid it receives from Western countries. He even said that the fighting would end a month or two after the aid was cut off. However, this was met with skepticism, and Zelensky, joined by other Ukrainian officials, dismissed it, saying that Putin's readiness for negotiations was actually a way to prolong the war and use the situation to Moscow's advantage. Zelensky immediately dismissed Putin's statement as an excuse to avoid peace talks and continue the war. The Ukrainian president accused Putin of being afraid of negotiations and using cynical tricks to delay a possible conflict resolution. Zelensky's remarks, which went viral on social media platforms, reflected his belief that Putin's actions were designed to prolong the war rather than seek a peaceful end. Since Donald Trump's inauguration as U.S. president, there has been increasing international pressure on both sides to end the conflict. One of the most contentious points remains the question of who has the legitimacy to negotiate peace and sign any possible agreement. These tensions mean much more than the simple rhetoric and behavior of the two leaders. For Zelensky, peace talks with Russia are about stopping the bloodshed and misery caused by the war, but on terms that respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In contrast, for Putin, legitimacy is at the heart of the question of negotiating peace from a position of strength. These are the Kremlin's constant claims against the illegitimate Zelensky government to undermine Ukraine's position on the international stage and impose its preconditions within this crisis. The further refusal of direct negotiations has worsened the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, as civilians bear the brunt of the ongoing conflict. There is no way out of this no man's land, and the war continues with both sides involved. Prior to this impasse, the international community had called for a renewed dialogue, but any hope for meaningful negotiations seems increasingly remote. Thank you for following us.